Okay, so we're diving into this whole tariff war thing that seems to have really kicked off with the Trump administration back on April 2nd.
Right.
That was when those initial tariffs were announced. And then pretty quickly after that, we got that deadline of April 8th for China to either back down or face even more tariffs,
Yeah.
if they retaliated. And you sent over a really interesting set of sources for this one, looking at this from all sides.
Yeah. I tried to find a good
Oh,
variety
right.
for you.
It's like we've got China's direct response and how countries like Malaysia and the EU are looking at this whole thing. We've even got Trump's own take on it, and then some really in-depth analysis of where this could all be going.
Yeah. And I think what's really fascinating about the material you've shared is that it kind of goes beyond, just the surface level headlines that we see every day. It gives us a sense of the historical context behind all of this and how that's shaping these reactions. And then, the possible shifts in, global power dynamics that might be happening as a result of all of this, and then also the pressures that are kind of building up within the U.S. itself domestically.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is.
But our goal with this deep dive is to kind of pull out the core of what you need to know from all of this.
Right.
The key issues, what's at stake for different countries, and the potential long-term consequences without getting totally bogged down in the details.
Yeah, like overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information.
Exactly.
Okay, so I guess let's just jump right into it then.
Sounds good.
Let's start with China's reaction because it seemed pretty immediate and pretty strong.
Yeah, definitely not holding back at all.
Yeah, no kidding.
So the sources really highlight right away that China is very, very firmly opposed to these tariffs.
Yeah.
They came out swinging, condemning the U.S. tariffs as a clear breach of international trade rules and as a form of economic bullying, basically.
Wow.
And we've got this statement from the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Lin Jin, from April 8th.
Right.
That really sums up their position.
Yeah.
He emphasized that this is damaging the global trade system and violating the legitimate rights of all the nations involved.
Right.
So the initial takeaway here is that China viewed this as an aggressive act from the get-go.
Not just talk.
Yeah, not just rhetoric. This was a serious move by the U.S. in their eyes. And I think, crucially, they also seem to be seeing some parallels to past economic instability in the region,
Oh, interesting.
which suggests a pretty high level of concern right from the start.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, when we're talking about a country like China with such a huge economy and so much global influence,
For sure.
they're not going to just sit back and let something like this happen without a fight.
Exactly. And the source we have here actually makes a point of saying that China needs to mount a sharp and comprehensive counterattack.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about words.
Right.
They were gearing up to take action and
Mhm.
quickly.
Yeah, the source really emphasizes the speed and forcefulness of their response.
Right. And I think when we connect this back to some of the historical context we find in those discussion minutes, particularly that 1997 Asian financial crisis,
Right.
it adds another layer to all of this.
Okay. How so?
Well, the source suggests that countries like Malaysia and potentially others in ASEAN might be viewing this current tariff war through the lens of that past economic upheaval.
Oh, I see.
And they might be worried about similar ripple effects hitting their region again.
Right, like a sense of here we go again.
Exactly. And, remember Mahathir Mohamad's very strong criticism of George Soros back then
Oh, yeah.
during that crisis. So there's a sense of maybe deja vu here.
Yeah. History repeating itself in a way.
Right.
And the analysis we have goes even further, suggesting that the U.S. might have a bigger strategy in mind here.
Yes, there's this idea that maybe the U.S. administration is using these tariffs to pressure Southeast Asian countries into forming some kind of anti-China alliance.
Wow, so it's not just about trade then?
Right? It's about geopolitics, too.
Wow.
And it's also being seen as a way to possibly undermine China's own regional economic initiatives, like the RCEP.
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Exactly.
Right.
Which is a really key part of their economic strategy in the Asia-Pacific.
Yeah, so the U.S. is kind of trying to put a wrench in the works there.
Potentially. Yeah. And there's an even more cynical perspective presented in one of the sources.
Okay, what's that?
It suggests that the U.S. might be trying to exploit this situation.
How?
Well, they're saying that the U.S., through its ability to print money on a large scale,
Right.
might be trying to buy the bottom of countries facing economic troubles as a result of these tariffs.
So basically like swooping in and taking advantage of distressed assets if these countries start to struggle.
Exactly. pretty bold claim.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting how this whole thing is playing out on multiple levels at once. We've got the trade war itself, but then also these underlying geopolitical tensions, and then the potential for economic fallout that could ripple out and affect a whole bunch of other countries.
Yeah, it's a very interconnected situation.
Definitely. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about how other countries are reacting.
Okay.
Starting with Malaysia. It looks like their Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, didn't waste any time.
No, he didn't.
Yeah.
On April 6th, he announced that ASEAN would coordinate their response to these U.S. tariffs.
So they're not just going to sit back and watch this happen.
Right. It seems like they're aiming for a united regional front.
Okay.
And I think that's a pretty significant move because, Malaysia currently holds the chair of ASEAN.
Right.
So their initiative here to try and forge a unified regional stance really indicates how concerned they are about potential disruptions to their interconnected supply chains.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it also suggests that ASEAN wants to have a stronger collective voice when dealing with these kind of major global trade disputes.
So strength in numbers.
Huh.
Okay, so that's ASEAN. What about the European Union? How are they responding?
Well, there was a British media report from April 7th that suggested EU member states are exploring some targeted retaliatory measures against a pretty substantial amount of U.S. imports.
How much are we talking about here?
Potentially up to $28 billion worth.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. But the source you provided also points out that the EU's actions are still in the exploratory stage.
So they're not, like, going all in right away?
Not yet. It seems like they're taking a more cautious approach for now.
Okay, and why is that?
Their own economic interests are obviously a big factor here.
Sure.
But there also seems to be a degree of caution. The Force uses this really interesting analogy describing China as the lead goose.
Okay.
The idea is that China's forceful initial response is creating a kind of updraft that other countries like the EU can kind of observe and maybe even benefit from.
Oh, I see. So they're waiting to see how the situation unfolds before they commit to any drastic actions themselves.
Exactly.
They're letting China take the lead. Okay. That's a really interesting way to look at it. Now, what about Trump himself? What was he saying during all of this?
Well, it seems like there were some conflicting messages coming out.
Really? Like what?
On April 6th, he was posting on social media, and he was basically painting a picture of a very deliberate strategy.
Mm.
He was suggesting that the stock market fluctuations were intentional.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that this was all part of a clever plan involving these tariffs that would ultimately benefit American manufacturing and the middle class.
So he was saying, trust me, I've got this.
Exactly.
Okay, but then what happened?
Well, just a day later, he was speaking to reporters on Air Force One,
Okay.
and his tone seemed to shift quite a bit.
Oh, so he was backtracking.
Kind of. He downplayed the idea that the market sell-off was planned.
Right.
And instead, he started blaming past administrations for allowing other countries to take advantage of the U.S.
Oh, so it's their fault, not his.
Right. He was basically shifting the blame. Yeah. Well, the analysis in your source suggests that this change in rhetoric might be a direct result of the criticism he was facing from some of his allies in the financial world.
Okay, so internal pressure.
Yeah, exactly. People like Bill Ackman and Stanley Druckenmiller were mentioned specifically as having voiced some concerns.
And these are big names on Wall Street, right?
Yeah, very influential figures within his support base. So that kind of pushback probably carries a lot of weight.
So it wasn't just international pressure he was facing, but also some serious unease from within his own camp.
Right.
Okay, so we've got this tariff war going on, and we've got China retaliating and other countries trying to figure out how to respond.
Right.
But then there's also this whole other layer of things happening within the U.S. itself.
Exactly.
It seems like there's a lot of internal conflict and maybe even some panic starting to brew.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to another really important point.
Okay, what's that?
Well, all of these tariffs were put in place with the intention of reducing the trade deficit and encouraging domestic production in the U.S.
Exactly.
But when you look at the actual trade data between China and the U.S., it tells a very different story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the figures from 2017 to 2024 show that even with the tariffs in effect, the total volume of trade between these two countries has actually increased.
So the tariffs didn't really work then?
It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
And what's even more interesting is that China's trade surplus with the U.S. has also grown.
So the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen.
Pretty much.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is, right? And the source argues that this actually points to a continued decline in U.S. manufacturing competitiveness and an increasing reliance of the U.S. economy on goods from Asia and particularly from China.
So the tariffs are actually hurting the U.S. more than helping?
Potentially.
Hmm.
And one of the sources even goes so far as to say that this whole tariff war is a fundamental misunderstanding of global economic realities.
Like they're trying to fight against the tide.
Exactly. They call it a blatant reversal of economic laws.
And the real kicker here is that this is all potentially backfiring on the U.S. and could end up benefiting China in the long run.
Yeah, that's the suggestion. It's like they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah, and there's even this really sarcastic remark in one of the sources about the idea of including Mexico in the U.S. tariff list or forcing them to impose tariffs on China.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. What was that all about?
Well, it's basically pointing out that in today's globalized economy, it's pretty much impossible to isolate one country through tariffs.
Right, because goods can just be rerouted through other countries.
Exactly, like trying to plug a hole in a leaky bucket.
It's just not going to work.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic side of things, but it's also clear that this whole situation has some pretty big geopolitical implications.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, countries are basically being forced to choose sides here, aren't they?
Yeah, that's a key takeaway from your sources.
It's U.S. or China?
Right. They argue that countries and international organizations, whether it's the EU, Japan, India, South Korea, they're all feeling this increasing pressure to align themselves with either one or the other.
And China's response is making it clear that there's a price to pay for siding against them.
Exactly. Their strong countermeasures are basically meant to make that cost as high as possible.
So they're not messing around.
Nope.
And even though the EU might have their own economic reasons to push back against the U.S. tariffs,
Right.
our sources suggest that there's still this underlying view of China as a potential adversary.
Yeah, they describe the EU's stance as cautious and vigilant.
Especially when it comes to non-traditional security issues.
Exactly. So even though they might be exploring countermeasures because of economic necessity, there's still this long-term strategic wariness about China's growing influence.
So they're walking a tightrope here.
Yeah, trying to balance their economic interests with their security concerns.
It's a tough spot to be in.
For sure. And what's really interesting is that one of the sources even mentions a potential increase in cooperation between the U.S. and Russia.
Really?
Yeah, on certain non-traditional security fronts.
So even as this tariff war is creating divisions within the traditional Western alliance,
Right.
it might be leading to some unexpected partnerships in other areas.
Exactly. It just
Wow.
goes to show how fluid the global power dynamics are becoming.
Yeah, definitely not a simple situation.
Not at all.
Hmm.
But I think the overall point is that this tariff war is creating a lot of disruption and potentially weakening the Western-led global order that we've been used to.
Especially in terms of financial influence.
Right.
And there's this really striking comparison in one of the sources to China's situation during the Korean War.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the source draws this parallel between China's position during the Korean War, where they were described as being low on steel but high on morale.
Right.
And the current situation with the U.S., which is being portrayed as being low on steel and low on morale.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in the context of this tariff war.
So they're saying that the U.S. is kind of weak and demoralized right now.
That's the suggestion.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
a pretty bold statement.
It's a very provocative comparison, and it really makes you question the underlying strength and the long-term resolve of the U.S. in this whole economic conflict.
Right.
And it suggests that maybe this whole thing is being driven more by frustration than by a carefully thought-out plan.
Okay, so given all of this, what are some of the potential consequences that your sources outline as a result of this tariff war?
Well, they point to three major ones.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, they anticipate economic difficulties and disruptions for both China and the U.S.
Okay.
In the U.S., this could mean factory closures, job losses, increased inflation, and reduced consumer spending,
Right.
especially if the tariffs really start to hinder U.S. exports.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there's also the whole issue of the U.S. printing money,
Right.
which they touch on quite a bit.
Okay.
They highlight how crucial China's cooperation has been in the past in mitigating risks to the U.S. financial market.
Through their holdings of U.S. debt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the implication is that if China decides to stop cooperating,
It could get ugly.
yeah, it could get very ugly.
And then the second major consequence they talk about revolves around the potential for even more internal conflict within the U.S.,
Right.
particularly within the financial sector.
Yeah. So they're saying that this combination of China's strong response and the resulting instability in the U.S. financial markets is likely to intensify the divisions we're already seeing within the U.S.
Especially among those big Wall Street players.
Exactly. And they even suggest that Trump might try to get some kind of tacit approval from Beijing
For what?
for large-scale money printing,
Oh, wow. So he might have to go hat in hand to China for help.
potentially, especially if he doesn't achieve his objectives within a relatively short time frame.
And what's the time frame they're talking about?
They mentioned about 3 months, starting around mid-April.
There's not a lot of time.
No, not at all.
And if he doesn't succeed in that time frame.
Then the U.S. financial market could be in for some serious trouble.
Right.
Made even worse by all that maturing national debt we talked about earlier and the potential for backlash from within the U.S. itself.
Even from within his own base.
Yeah, it could get very messy.
And then the third potential consequence really highlights how precarious the situation is for the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, this is where that whole issue of the maturing national debt comes into play in a big way.
Okay.
So if the U.S. launches this huge QE program...
Quantitative easing.
Right.
Pumping money into the economy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If they do that without at least the implicit agreement of China...
Which holds a lot of that U.S. debt.
Right. Then the stability of the U.S. dollar could be seriously at risk.
Wow. So they're saying that China basically has the power to make or break the dollar.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And the source describes this as an extremely cruel and highly sensitive game between Trump and the financial markets.
Oh, yeah.
The suggestion is that if Wall Street feels like they're not benefiting from this game...
They could turn on him.
Exactly.
And that could leave him with no choice but to try and negotiate some kind of compromise with China.
Right. On these fundamental issues of global power and security.
Okay, so it's not just about trade anymore.
Nope. It's about the whole balance of power in the world.
What?
And finally, your sources touch on China's role in all of this from a global perspective.
Right.
And there's this quote from Pascal Lamy.
The former Director General of the WTO.
Exactly. And he basically says that the most effective way to respond to Trump's tactics, which he calls extortion, is to fight back toughly.
No messing around.
Nope.
And what's interesting is that the source then goes on to argue that while the WTO was initially set up to benefit U.S. interests,
Primarily,
right,
China is now, in a way, stepping in to safeguard it.
because this tariff war is undermining the whole system.
Exactly.
So they're saying that even though the WTO might have a bit of a controversial history,
Right.
it still provides a framework that benefits most countries.
And China is now the one defending that framework.
Interesting.
It is, right.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. We've got these tariffs, the immediate reaction from China, the more cautious responses from other players like Malaysia and the EU.
Right.
And then all this internal pressure building up within the U.S. itself. And on top of all that, the trade data isn't even really supporting the stated goals of these tariffs.
Yeah, it's a mess.
It really is. And it's clear from the sources that this is way more than just a simple trade dispute between two countries.
For sure.
It has huge implications for the entire global economic order.
Absolutely.
And when you consider all the different factors we've talked about, the economic pressures, the political motivations, the shifting alliances,
Right.
it really makes you wonder what the deciding factor will be and how this whole thing plays out.
Yeah, what's going to tip the scales one way or the other.
Exactly.
It's a complex situation with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, and the sources we've looked at today offer a really insightful but also kind of unsettling look at what the future might hold.
Definitely food for thought.
For sure.